John Coltrane is remembered as one of the greatest saxophone players in history. But before he became a legend, he spent years listening and learning from others. Born in 1926 in North Carolina, Coltrane grew up at a time when jazz was spreading through radio, records, and live shows across the country. He was always curious, and he paid close attention to the artists who came before him. These early influences affected the way he played, pushed him to keep practicing, and gave him ideas that later turned into his own voice on the saxophone. But before Coltrane could craft his own revolutionary sound, he needed a spark, a guiding light who showed him what was possible. The first name on his list changed everything. Who was it? Charlie Parker, the one with the spark. Charlie Parker transformed the scope of a saxophone player, and he left an imprint on the life of John Coltrane at an early age. Coltrane heard Parker still playing on alto, and he once told a story about how he first heard Bird. That struck him between the eyes. Records like Coco, Billy Bounce, Now's the Time, and Ornithology are records that kicked off bebop by Parker. Those sides presented a novel method of reducing swift lines into limited harmonic alterations. Young Coltrane would listen to those records and he would have them close to his practice routine. Coltrane's lines were memorized by Parker. He wrote and he repeated the solos until his fingers worked out the phrases. His key aids to learning vocabulary and timing were transcribing. He slackened time, echoed phrases, and wrote them one at a time. The process allowed him to hear how Parker put tones and measured accents in a bar. Coltrane frequently went back to Bird when practicing. In his early records, Parker was left behind in the sound of Coltrane. In the late 40s and early 50s, Coltrane employed bebop phrases and short motives that resembled the style of Bird. Analysts observed some of the phrases in Coltrane's solos to be contours of the first tracks by Parker. Examples of those include fast arpeggio runs, concise motives, and abrupt turns of direction within a chorus. The fact that those motives exist demonstrates that there's a direct connection between the records by Parker and the practice and performance of Coltrane. Another aspect that was influenced by Parker was rhythm as practiced by Coltrane. The syncopation, as well as abrupt accents and varying pulse within a phrase by Bird, became routines Coltrane practiced every day. He adapted sudden tempos and attacks, and also learned how to achieve accents that sliced through the texture of a band. Parker's records provided numerous patterns of how to hold a forward motion when the harmony revolved below the soloist. Throughout his career, Coltrane used the records of Bird that he kept in his bag. Listening to Parker provided him with a series of instruments for quick harmonies and different phrasing. Parker gave raw material, which Coltrane applied as he formed a bigger voice. The connection between the two of them is manifested in interviews and the lyrics, which lead to Bird. Both players are still studied by musicians to understand how ideas flowed in and out of them. Those early contacts are recorded, transcribed, and interviewed. To Coltrane, the lines of Parker were the building blocks on which future generations built and are still very popular. But if Parker laid the foundation for Coltrane's voice, what happened when Coltrane encountered someone who shattered the very rules of rhythm and harmony, forcing him to rethink everything he knew? Dizzy Gillespie. Dizzy Gillespie brought jazz to new dimensions, and the records he made are mentioned in different interviews by Charles Coltrane. Coltrane once wrote that he had been initially open to music exploration by Dizzy Gillespie and Bird. Gillespie was the master of bebop, and he took harmony and rhythm in a new direction in the 1940s. Songs like A Night in Tunisia were heard by many, and in 1947 he recorded Manteca with Cuban percussionist Chano Pozo, combining Afro-Cuban rhythm with big band arrangement. New rhythms and percussion were introduced into jazz by those records, and they were performed on several platforms. Arrangers like Walter Gill Fuller collaborated with Gillespie, and he employed horn arrangements that were both tight on ensemble and gave room to soloists. He employed Cuban musicians, and he would be touring around the United States of America and Europe with those charts. His instrument was wide with interval jumps, bright attack, and syncopated accents. In records, he would create a distinct melody and make space that could enable a solo to dance on a rich background. Most of such groups and big bands were on the study pile of a young saxophonist who desired to see some examples of modern phrasing. Coltrane touted Gillespie in interviews and biographies. Gillespie records are listed in Coltrane discographies and in charts of records that John Coltrane owned. These sides exhibit ways of inserting a solo over shifting chords and of riding on a powerful band throb as a band played heaped percussion. The introduction of repeated percussion rhythms and Afro-Cuban talking motifs made by Gillespie with Chano Pozo served as a second section of the band, functioning as a rhythm. That machine or device is recorded on tape and on stage. In case Gillespie employed Cuban percussion patterns in sections with horn line, Coltrane later recorded with larger groups, and in 1961, he made albums that involved larger groups and different textural changes. Old Coltrane in Africa, brass exhibit modal motions and wide sonorities, which are the result of experimenting with the arrangement and hearing many rhythms of all types. The combination of showmanship and use of modernization in arranging by Gillespie also influenced the way big bands arrange solos and the placement of the written figures. His blazing tours and radio frequency made his records be everywhere in clubs and even in record stores. Coltrane listened to such records both at home and in clubs, and the works are listed among the concrete objects by those who follow his initial record preferences. He kept his records featuring heavily. Dizzy Gillespie is another name that is easily documented among the performers that Coltrane engaged with. But Coltrane's world was about to shift. The man who would test his patience, sharpen his sound, and push him toward greatness was waiting. What happened when Miles Davis called his name? Miles Davis. In the mid-1950s, Miles Davis recruited John Coltrane, and the employment was a definite turning point in Coltrane's career. In recording with Miles, Coltrane was exposed to a regular work schedule and regular recording. During the same years, the band used to have Red Garland, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones on board in terms of piano, bass, and drums, respectively. These players were closely knit as a rhythm section that encouraged every solo. Cannonball Adderley, alto saxophone, and Bill Evans piano were added to some later sessions. Coltrane performed in studios and live performances, which had far-reaching audiences. Miles preferred when there was silence and few notes in length. He then picked tracks whose word or phrase would make a difference, and the spacing of notes would modify the tune. Coltrane featured with Miles on subsequent well-known records, such as Roundabout Midnight, Milestones, and Kind of Blue. Those are records of Coltrane at various levels as a group member and an evolving soloist. Coltrane made recordings in the studio that formed part of various collections and subsequent anthologies. The band led by Miles Davis on stage dispelled a definite time and maintained a strong play, managing to have space to improvise. These interpretations of Coltrane in these settings have short statements in the form of solos and protracted choruses that develop beat and tempo. Those who had worked with the two men observed that Miles, in most cases, offered Coltrane a direction to lengthen a phrase to help him last in other bands. The unchanging regular tour route and the in-studio concerts frequently held provided Coltrane with a real-life experience of performance in the field. The name of Coltrane became bigger when he joined Miles. His playing in front of bigger audiences was contributed to by radio play, appearances in clubs, and the release of records. Coltrane's performances were ever great. That exposure resulted in a request to do sessions under his own name and the opportunity to chair recording dates. Some of Miles Davis's recording sessions retained the early recorded Coltrane developments. Solo performances on those records reveal a performer gaining mastery over harmonic structure, rhythm, and expression. Coltrane took Miles out to record and tour as a leader, but just as Coltrane was finding his voice with Miles, fate threw him into a far stranger challenge, one that would bend his sound, test his patience, and redefine his path forever. Could a single pianist truly reshape Coltrane's entire approach to music? Thelonious Monk. The turning point. John Coltrane joined Thelonious Monk in 1957 for a brief but famous residency at the Five Spot Cafe in New York. Monk hired Coltrane to play at the club, and the quartet worked almost nightly from spring into summer. The group included Wilbur Ware on bass and Shadow Wilson on drums for many dates, and they also made several studio recordings in 1957. Those studio tracks were later gathered on albums such as Thelonious Monk with John Coltrane and on complete sets released by record labels. Playing with Monk required close attention to odd chords and to unexpected rhythmic placement. Monk used sharp, dissonant voicings, and he often left space where other pianists would fill sound. Coltrane had to alter his timing and his note choices so his lines fit Monk's chords and his loose pulses. Playing at the Five Spot pushed Coltrane to hear harmony in new ways and to react quickly during a solo. Recordings from April through July of 1957 capture the quartet in both studio and live settings. Tracks like Blue Monk and Well You Needn't show Coltrane working inside Monk tunes, and test takes show him changing ideas between versions. Producers later assembled these sessions into an album that Riverside Records issued after Coltrane had become a leader. Those tracks were later reissued in box sets that collect the complete 1957 material. Witness accounts from clubgoers and from journalists recorded that the band played long sets and that listeners reacted strongly to the contrast between Monk's piano and Coltrane's tenor. Audio collectors later found live tapes and radio recordings that added more material to the known set list from those weeks. A Carnegie Hall recording and other discovered tapes expanded published collections decades later. The period during which Monk and Coltrane operated has been one of the most explicit accounts of a working relationship between two progressive jazz bands in the 1950s. The sessions captured a short recorded catalog, which musicians analyzed to trace how Coltrane's lines were changing in that season. Those documents and videos record a musician who modified his attitude and positioned his statements in a band setting. Studio material was issued by record labels such as Riverside and Jazzland, and subsequently box sets gathered the vast majority of the surviving tapes and session notes. There are still collectors, writers, and reissue makers who are not satisfied with what has been published about this period, who issue newly found material. Those are the ones that provide accurate dates of sessions. But if Coltrane's time with Monk revealed how quickly he was evolving inside a band, what happened next showed something different, how he stood toe-to-toe with equals. What happens when admiration turns into rivalry? Sonny Stitt. The relationship of John Coltrane with Sonny Stitt was not established through a long-term association with working together in one band, but stemmed rather from mutual respect, which arose out of how each of them attacked the tenor saxophone. Depending on his quick style and his skills of crossing comfortably between alto and tenor saxophones, Stitt already had his name in the 1940s and 1950s and was a renowned musician. He was frequently criticized as an imitation of Charlie Parker on alto and Lester Young on tenor, but Stitt has gained a name for never being exhausted in long solos. It took Coltrane even less time before the artist achieved greater recognition because Stitt already had dozens of recordings as a leader. The greatest convergence occurred in 1960 when Coltrane parted with the Miles Davis Quintet and started making his own band. Before assuming permanence of his new quartet, Coltrane toured with Stitt in Europe with jazz at the Philharmonic, also under the management of Norman Granz. The two saxophonists were in the front line, and each night the audiences were listening to two great icons. Stitt preferred bebop that was more flowing as it went between changes of chords, whereas Coltrane was already swaying towards the use of longer solos, which consisted of harmonic replacements and sheet music. The contrast between them made each concert a duel. Although they both admired each other, their listeners did a comparison of their styles. Some found Stitt playing smoother and more under control, and others enjoyed Coltrane playing restlessly and aimlessly. What is definite is the fact that both musicians lived off the challenge. A number of performances at these concerts exist in recorded form, and they provide a fair idea about the dynamism of the performances. Stitt has even been recognized by Coltrane himself. He liked the manner in which Stitt was a consistent and practicing person. Stitt, on his part, commended Coltrane because of his adventurous approach. Such a combination of competitiveness and admiration put Stitt in a special position among his contemporaries in Coltrane. However, unlike the rest, who only followed in Coltrane and did not break the voice that belonged to them, Stitt stood out in retaining his own voice, and that impressed Coltrane. Their friendship was destined to be short, but the moments spent together on tour remained in the minds of jazz history. Coltrane valued Stitt as a musician who made him stay sharp. In the case of Coltrane, Stitt was a popular competitor whose appearance served as one of the main milestones by which to mark a step in his career. But if Stitt sharpened Coltrane's competitive edge, there was another saxophonist who went even deeper, pushing Coltrane not just to play harder, but to completely rethink music itself. Who was that man? Sonny Rollins. The musical bond between Sonny Rollins and John Coltrane is difficult to deny, as it is reflected in the recordings. In the early 50s, Rollins became a celebrity with his albums like Saxophone Colossus and an artist like Street Thomas that received extensive publicity. His effort was on the power of solos out of minimal musical concepts. Coltrane listened to those records, and he singled out Rollins when discussing saxophonists whom he admired. Coltrane composed a song called Like Sonny and made a recording towards the end of the 1950s. This connection can be heard by comparing the solos brought by Rollins to the pieces of his work by Coltrane of that time. This has been expressed in the motif development and the repeating figures used around motifs. It is true that Coltrane borrowed a format used by Rollins and employed it with other strategies he had been studying. They always meant to work on their music. Reports from contemporaries show they often left a set having changed something in the way they approached a run. Rollins proved useful to Coltrane as a model for structure in a solo, whereas other players supplied fast runs or new harmonic tricks. Rollins offered a clear template for extending a short idea across an entire performance. Coltrane used that template when he wanted a single melodic shape to guide long improvisations. Their respect was mutual. In performances, Rollins talked about Coltrane professionally and complimented his brawny sound each time. Meanwhile, Coltrane maintained the records of Rollins in rotation and came back to them in practice. Certainly, America's commitment to Like Sonny is one of the distinct indicators of respect. Those contents display a rapport that contrasts friendship, competitiveness, and the process of sharpening each other over several nights of being together in jazz. Johnny Hodges. Johnny Hodges had a shot at fame as the alto saxophone star in the orchestra of Duke Ellington. He was recognized by his rich, singing voice. Hodges gave many solos on Ellington classics during the 1930s and 1970s. Jeep's Blues and Warm Valley are the titles that are frequently attributed to Hodges, and his long beats and smooth phrasing have been eminent. It is to those records and radio broadcasts that Coltrane listened as he was learning the horn. Early biographies and accounts mention Hodges among those players that Coltrane liked as a young man. A characteristic of the approach taken by Hodges was the ability of an alto to deliver a note with a feeling and maintain a firm, round sound. Hodges was a role model to those who believed every note was important. Technically, Hodges did it with slow vibrato, judicious bends, and a rounded embouchure to achieve his sound. His preferences were for simple instruments that did not congest the line. Hodges used to insert little rises and descents between two lines, and therefore the melody sounded inhabited. The sound of that playing formed memorable lines for listeners. In switching to tenor, Coltrane was tempted occasionally to make a bigger sound that could sing alto like Hodges. Coltrane interpreted broad, slow beats during his recordings of ballads in a loose vibrato, which is similar to the older records made by Hodges. Hodges is among the older voices in the saxophone with which Coltrane continued practicing. According to those archival documents and interviews from those days, Hodges was mentioned along with Coleman Hawkins and Ben Webster as a phenomenal influence. Johnny Hodges also maintained his long recording life after his prime years with Duke Ellington. He held seminars with record labels, but his delivery and wording were the same over the decades. Those records have remained in the possession of collectors and reissue producers, which is why today, listeners can make comparisons between the solos of Hodges and subsequent solos of the saxophone. Hodges stands in the list of players Coltrane respected for tone, lyricism, and a clear singing approach on the horn. The templates of phrasing and tone continue to be looked at by many jazz lovers through listening to the records of Hodges. John Coltrane's list of favorite artists gives us a window into the sounds that shaped him and the people he admired most. Each musician he named carried their own weight in jazz history, and together they created a map of the voices that inspired him to keep moving forward. Looking back, it is clear that Coltrane's choices were guided by his deep love of music. Thank you for staying with us through this story. Do not forget to like this video, leave a comment, subscribe, and check out the next one we have prepared.